research. The second is psychology. The third is anthropology, and the fourth is history.
Nice. So, David was telling us what he's going to talk about. I'm Miriam from CPNN. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel and also um, check our website at cpnn-world.org. I'm here to talk with Dr. David Adams. Are humans naturally aggressive? So our guest is in his second life with us. This is our project called Pieces in Our Hands, where we are going to interview different people that had good contributions in culture of peace. Dr. David Adams presenting him, welcome, and welcome everyone that is watching us. He's an American peace activist, scientist, scholar, writer, and journalist. And as a professor in Wesleyan University, he ran a brain research laboratory and published many scientific articles. Adams has served at UNESCO, where he worked on the Culture of Peace initiative that eventually led to the International Year of Culture of Peace. And he had a lot of contributions in the world. He still works with a lot of civil society organizations and youth. Welcome, Dr. David Adams.
Thank you.
So, we would like to talk with you today about this main question. So for you, are humans naturally aggressive?
It's a very difficult question because there are many answers. We are, like other animals, aggressive in the sense that we can get angry and we can fight. And we also have social behaviors that are very complicated, that are aggressive, such as crime, murder, and war. And yes, we are aggressive, but it's not all the same. It's different kinds of aggression, and I want to talk about that.
I know that you made a research, so I would like to see with you like what are these types of aggression and how was your research? Could you tell you a little bit to us?
Well, I've been through at least 4 different kinds of research in my lifetime. I started off in brain research, then I did research in psychology, then in anthropology, and then in history. So let me begin with the first research, which I began in 1962. In 1962, I had finished college and I went to Yale University, which was a very famous university, to study brain research. And 1962 was a special year because it was the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was then that many of us realized, for the first time, that we could destroy the planet completely and destroy all human civilization. And with the missiles in Cuba that had nuclear warheads, we were afraid we were starting a nuclear war. Well, I went into a laboratory at the university just to see what was going on in the laboratories, and there was a laboratory that interested me because it was a laboratory where they were doing electrical stimulation of the brain in cats. And if they passed the electricity through the electrode in the cat's brain, the cat would attack a rat. He would not attack a rat before then in his cage, but if you put in the stimulation, he would jump up and kill the rat. But if you stopped the electricity before he got to the rat, he would stop and go meow as if he didn't understand what was happening. So I could see that you could control aggression in the brain. And so I worked in that laboratory and got my PhD there. In fact, I was the first person ever to record from single brain cells that were responsible for a behavior. I was recording from the brain cells that are necessary when a cat fights. And when cats fight, and I could record from these cells, and they only fired when the cat was fighting. If I stimulated them, the cat would fight, and if I destroyed them, the cat would not be able to fight anymore. So for 25 years, I worked in the laboratory thinking that somehow if I could understand the brain mechanisms of aggression, I could understand war and the other problems that we had, which had led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. For 25 years, we produced many papers. We could understand what was happening in the brain. And finally, I realized and discovered that I was completely wrong, that the brain mechanisms of aggression have nothing to do with war at all. Now, let me tell you why.
Why?
Because in those years, I also started another kind of research, which was psychological research. If you study soldiers in a war, they are not aggressive, they are not angry. Instead, they're afraid. Now, they're aggressive in the sense that they may kill, but that's not an emotion and it's not an instinct. It's simply following orders. And the emotions that they have are primarily fear. In fact, during World War II, the majority of US soldiers never even fired a rifle against anyone because they didn't want to kill. And nowadays, they have special training for the military to train people to kill using television games, because people don't naturally kill. Now, and in fact, you don't even meet the enemy. You don't know who the enemy is. How can you be angry at someone you don't even meet? Well, I also did the research on peace activists. And guess what? Whether it was Mahatma Gandhi or Martin Luther King or Nelson Mandela, they all started their activism when they were angry, when they were angry against injustice. It's called righteous indignation. In fact, anger is necessary for peace, and it's not necessary for war. There's an interesting illustration of why anger is not for war. But yes, you have another question.
I have a comment actually, that you wrote a book about psychology for peace activists, and it's also in your website, right?
Yes. So you can read it online, and there you have Gandhi and King and Mandela and many others who's used their anger against injustice as a motivation.
And people confuse that peace is something calm, and actually it's not, right?
No. The real peace activists are very active and angry and motivated. But they have to learn not to be angry against people. They have to be angry against systematic injustice. But I want to make an illustration of where anger is not good for war. During the first Gulf War, the head of the army and the military in Saudi Arabia that was attacking Iraq was General Schwarzkopf. And he had a bad temper, and he was always getting angry at his colonels. And the Secretary of Defense from the United States, whose name was Dick Cheney at the time, took a plane specially to Saudi Arabia to confront General Schwarzkopf and tell him if he did this anymore, he'd be fired, because getting angry at your soldiers is not good for their morale. So there's no place for anger. And in fact, if you're a soldier and you get angry at your superior officer, they throw you in jail or in the brig, the prison, because you have no right to be angry. Anyway, at that time, I was part of an international society called the International Society for Research on Aggression. And we had a meeting in Holland, and we discussed all of this, and we decided that we should invite the best scientists from around the world to address the question, is war part of human nature? And so eventually we met in Seville, Spain. We had geneticists and brain researchers, psychologists, anthropologists, very famous people from all over the world. And we wrote a document saying that war is a social invention. It's not an instinct. There's no brain mechanism for war. There's no genetic code for war. In fact, if you look at the course of evolution, animals that cooperate with each other survive better than animals that fight among each other. Now, of course, this does not include predation of animals that eat other animals for their food. But animals don't eat their own species, they eat other species. So you can call that aggression if you want, but it's not the same as war, obviously. Well, eventually we issued this statement in Seville, and the statement was endorsed by scientific organizations: the American Anthropological Association, American Sociological Association, American Psychological Association, the big scientific organizations that are concerned with human behavior. And at the endorsement of the American Psychological Association, I ran the press conference. And I called the different media saying, the psychologists of America have decided that war is not part of human nature, and please come to a press conference. They refused to come. And in fact, one of them said to me on the phone, we're not interested in that. That's not interesting to us. But when you do find the genetics of war, call us back and we'll come. Now, why is this? What is this opposition to understanding that war is not part of human nature? You have to go back 2 centuries to the end of slavery. At the end of slavery, when it was becoming obvious that slavery was no longer a good idea, those who, especially at big universities, who had a vested interest in slavery, they began to publish papers saying that black people are inferior, and that's why they have to be slaves. And they claimed that there was a biological justification for slavery. And nowadays, when we see that war is not a good idea and people begin to be against it, those who have a vested interest in war have every interest to have the mass media say that there is genetics for war, war is part of human nature, etc. And so the mass media will not support this idea.
By knowing that the mass media and also the governments spread a lot of fear, what can you tell us about fear? And today we see a raising fear culture promoted by them. So what could we do to avoid or to make a balance with more culture of peace news?
Well, I think nowadays with the internet, we have more and more opportunities to have an alternative to the commercial media and alternatives to government propaganda. And so people can begin talking directly, like we are doing today, to understand what's going on. I want to go on, though, with the question of research, because we could tell you that war is not part of human nature, but then the question is, why is war so universal? Why do we have war? And so that's another question that I began to research. And I started with anthropology to look at the prehistory of war. Where did it come from? What we found it's called cross-cultural anthropological research. What we found is that war began a long time ago as one of the first social inventions in prehistory, and it was practiced most of the time like a sport. And so that warriors were trained, and they knew how to use a bow and arrow and a spear and so forth. And they did this like a sport because if there was a drought and a famine, and it was a question of survival of the group, life or death, then they could go and make a surprise attack on another village and take their food and survive. And the villages that had good military training were those that would survive. So from the very beginning of prehistory, war was useful in that sense. But there was another invention at that time. The first 2 inventions of human beings, social inventions, war and marriage. Now, marriage was very interesting because the young men were armed and could kill each other. You didn't want fights over women within your village, and so the men always married a girl from another village where there was not any competition with the other men in his own village. Now that meant, though, and it's in anthropology, it's called I forget the term for it, but when you marry outside your own village. But that means that if there was a war, you couldn't trust the women because the war was between her husband on the one side and her father and brother on the other side of the war. So women had split loyalties in war. And so they, from the very beginning of prehistory, women were excluded from war. And war, only men could make war. Now we could understand war, what war came from in the beginning. But war was transformed once you had empires like those in China or Egypt or Mesopotamia, or in the New World, the Incas and the Aztecs and the Mayans. The state, as you began to have states, they had war for other reasons. They had war in order to get slaves, because the economies in those times, the first empires, were based on slavery, and you had to have a military to keep from having slave rebellions internally, or from having any other. In fact, what militaries came to be functioning over the course of history is that the military is used by the state to maintain its power against any opposition. You can see that in modern days, for example, Egypt, where the military took over. But what people don't realize, and this is from the historical research that I did, is that so-called democratic countries also use the military to put down any rebellions. I wrote a paper in the Journal of Peace Research that just simply listed the internal military interventions in the United States for 150 years. Over the course of 150 years, there were an average of 12 military interventions and 12,000 soldiers per year used, first of all, to stop slave rebellions in the 19th century, then to kill indigenous peoples and take their land at the end of the 19th century, and then against workers' strikes and urban riots in the 20th century. And what people don't remember is that when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans a few years ago, the United States sent in the military to control people so that there couldn't be looting in the stores and so forth. It's the arm of the state for its power. So for 5,000 years, war and the preparations for war have been almost universal. Doesn't mean it's biological, but it's been very useful. But things changed with the invention of nuclear weapons. What Einstein said is that everything has changed except our thinking, because now, if there is a World War III, we will destroy everything.
Yeah. We have some comments and questions. I'm learning a lot with you, David, and it's an honor to be here with you. And I'm glad that we can broadcast this so more people can get to know and get a little bit from your knowledge. So we have some questions and some comments. One comment is from Gwen. It's interesting, she says, because in our collective unconscious, remember Star Wars, anger is the source of violence. And we have a question from Herbert. He asks, the connected to angry contribute to war. How to fight that peacefully if possible?
Well, in the end of the 19th century, you had the development of communist parties and Marxism that believed that if you took over the state by armed power, you could make peace, and that socialism would be peaceful. But it turns out that it doesn't work that way, that once the socialist countries, once the communist parties took power in countries, they became cultures of war just like their enemies, because they also set up militaries and used the military for internal control. So obviously, the methods that we use must not be the methods of armed revolution. They have to be methods of peaceful revolution.
And would you have any tips so we can make this peace revolution? What could you recommend us?
Well, we talked about this last week or 2 weeks ago when I said that I had the fortune of working at the United Nations at UNESCO when Federico Mayor was the Director General of UNESCO. And we developed a vision of a culture of peace that would be developed by the United Nations if the United Nations were run by the people and not by the nation states, that we could have peace. And in fact, we worked on developing peace in countries such as Mozambique and El Salvador, where those who had been enemies we got them to work together on projects that would be helpful to both sides. It's possible.
It is possible. I believe that too. And I want to say hello for some of the people that are watching us. Gwen, Ed, Clara, Ana, Lourdes, Alice, Cor, Maria. A lot of people from Brazil actually. And we are going to see if we can have translation by some point during our next interviews. So I have a question from Clara Boto. She's asking, if possible, I would like to know from the professor at which point did humans start dealing with their egos and traces like pride, since other animals don't have it?
I think I don't know the answer to that question. Does she have an idea about where it came from? Because I don't.
I don't know either, so maybe something for us to look for. And Clara, if you have answers for that, please share with us, because we would love to know. And yeah, and would be really nice if you could share, like, with other researchers that are watching us, what would you recommend them so they can, because for example in Brazil we have a lot of not the government and other places don't invest in research, and sometimes it's very hard to keep the willing of doing the research. And do you have a message for scientists around the world and around Brazil as well? What could you tell them?
Well, we started at a certain point in fact, in Brazil, at some point we had some peace commissions in cities, and there were, I think in Sao Paulo, there was a commission that was doing research just to measure the culture of peace year by year in the different parts of the city. And so I think that's a good idea, just to measure culture of peace. We talked last time about the 8 aspects of a culture of peace: women's equality, human rights, education for peace, solidarity, disarmament, democratic participation, free flow of information, and sustainable development. And so these can be measured scientifically, and we can see where we are making progress and what we need to do to make more progress. So this is a kind of research which is useful.
Nice. And would you have anything that you could tell them so they don't give up?
Well, one of the, first of all, you could mention the book. I've seen The Promised Land. Tenho visto Terra Prometida. Como se llama?
Tenho visto a Terra Prometida.
Yeah.
It's already online, and soon we'll have the second version, and you can check it in Portuguese now, and also in English and Spanish, right?
And French.
And French. And it's really nice. Would you like to tell us just a little bit, a resume about what is the book about?
Well, the book imagines it takes place in the year 2026, 6 years from now. I wrote it 10 years ago, so it was a while ago. And it begins with a crash, an economic crash in the year 2020. And then for 6 years, since the nation states are in bad shape, and they essentially abandon the United Nations, and so the United Nations is available to be taken over by other people. Now, who should take over the United Nations? It should be democratic. And where do we have democracy that is not in the state? We have it in the cities. Most cities are democratic. And so I imagine a mayor's security council that runs the Security Council of the United Nations. And we can start now by having a mayor security council that would issue statements all the time, what they would do if they were the Security Council of the UN. And of course, the first thing they would do would be to get rid of nuclear weapons, because no city wants nuclear weapons.
I love your vision, and I'm really willing to join you with other people, I'm sure. Question from Gwen Beauvais. Did I pronounce correct, Gwen? We have also good signs. The increase of feminist fights, the fights to stop violence against children globally. Do you think we are progressing?
Yes, I think there is progress, but you don't know it from the mass media. The mass media tells you about all the bad things that are happening in the world, and you have to look at media like CPNN, where we have the news from the culture of peace, and there we see that, yes, we are making progress.
Nice. And another question. I think we'll have time for this question and another one if someone wants to send us. So this is from Herbert as well. He says, we're watching a lot of activism from the couch. People just staying in their couch, and people using internet to communicate and building amazing things as well. But we also see a lot of aggression on social network, like in real life. But the truth is big media only broadcast the bad things. We have this PNN that is an alternative source of information broadcasting news to build culture of peace. Could you tell a little bit about CPNN website?
Yes, we started this in UNESCO in 1998 when we were going to do the International Year for the Culture of Peace. And the idea was to have people write their own stories about what was happening around the world, and that we would have reporters all over the world that would tell us what is happening for a culture of peace. That's still a dream, but so far it's not working very well. We have a few reporters, but mostly what I do is I look in the mass media to find stories about what people are doing for peace that I can reprint. And so there's about an average of one article a day coming from somewhere in the world where people are making a culture of peace and in their daily lives or in their communities. And so if you look at CPN, you see something new every day. And then every month we send out a bulletin of what's happened during the month. But I should say that CPNN is not the only source for things like this. If you look at CPNN, you'll see that we get stories from many other websites like Democracy Now! And Common Dreams in the United States that are other websites that have very good news. And I'm sure there are other alternative media in other countries like Brazil.
Yes, in Brazil I really like one. It's called Razões para Acreditar. And for sure we have more, and I really like CPNN. And if anyone wants to write to CPNN, you can just send a message to us, or you can enter in cpnn-world.org and send us your articles and be part of this movement to spread peace. And last question, David, how about the International Year for Culture of Peace? What were the results?
Well, the results were fantastic. We had 75 million people sign up. In Brazil, for example, the people that were doing the Manifesto 2000 were active during Carnival, and they went around having people sign up to say they would make a culture of peace, and they had to define what is a culture of peace, and this is what they would do in their families and their communities. And we had 75 million. We had more than 1 million in Colombia, Brazil, Algeria, South Korea, Japan, India. I think maybe a couple other countries had more than 1 million people signed up. But the big countries got scared because they're afraid of peace. They don't want peace. And so they came into UNESCO and they shut down the whole system. That's when I went and started CPNN and started studying the history of the culture of war to try to understand what was going on.
Yeah, but at the same time, when you tell us that we had 75 million people joining, it really reminds me a phrase that tells us that imagine what can a group of people like organized can do. We can shake the world, and in a good way. So it's time for us to maybe rescue this and make it again, so we don't have more wars and we can reduce this culture of war, so culture of peace can emerge. David, do you have any last message that you would like to tell our guests?
I think we now have the last words for each program was given to us last time. Is to think globally and act locally.
Yes, thank you, David, very much. Thank you, everyone that watched us, and please spread the news, spread our YouTube channel, support us, enter in our website at cpnn-world.org, and if you have any doubts, you can make comments or send us an email. And thank you a lot, David, and be be awake, that we're going to have other conversations with a lot of good people that are working for culture of peace. Peace is in our hands. Thank you. Oh, and also thank you, Herbert, because Herbert is working a lot here. He's also from CPNN. He's also a board member, and he was a lot working in the technology for us. That's it. Bye, David. Pode fechar aqui? Só fechar tudo? Sim?